good resources. At the end of the presentation, you guys we got a link to a few more resources as well. Also, most of my thoughts on the serve come from Dr. Mark Kovacs and Dr. Ben Kibler and things that I've learned from them. So a lot of the scientific stuff comes from those guys, and it's been great to just see how it applies as look at players and seeing what the pros do and what the juniors do is the main emphasis of this, and really learning what pros do well and what are those keys for the juniors. We're going to go through just some photos of comparing players that have platform stance at the beginning, and then we'll go to two players with a pinpoint stance. Obviously, these are players with very good serves, and the key really is for juniors to learn the basic things that they do well when they're young, and hopefully as they get older, they're developing serves that are just as good as these pros. So just starting with this first start here, the first thing really is the grip. And the key is pretty much all the pros are going to have continental to continental towards backhand grip on the serves, and that's fundamental. If you don't have a great serve grip, it's hard to have a great serve motion. Jumping over here, this is something, as you look in this next sequence, as the ball's coming out of their hand, what you see is that their weight is on their back foot. And this is something, as I see a lot of juniors, when the ball comes out of their hand, their weight's actually on their front foot, so they're losing a lot of, not just the power they could get on their back leg, but it later on will cause them to rotate really early in the motion, which tends to have them pulling down, hitting into the net. But this is one of the biggest things, and if any of you guys that have been through Dr. Mark Kovacs' presentation of the 8 stages, the release and the loading phases are really the two most important, I think, because if you have a bad release, if you have a bad load, it's hard to have a really good serve. So as we notice here, like I said, Federer actually has his front foot completely off the ground. That's some keys, just has it with her the weight on her back leg and just has her back heel for balance there. So then this is where you get into the load, and you see that because they started with their weight on their back foot, they are able, as they start to get into the load, now they're balanced and they have the weight on pretty much on both legs and are able to use both legs of the serve. Once again, you watch many juniors, and because of how they started, their weight's on their front leg, and now not only is it inefficient as far from a power standpoint, but it's also, as they get older, it's a chance for them potentially to be injured because they're using one leg a lot more than the other for the serve, and as far as execution, when it gets in the front foot, it tends to pull down into the net a lot. If you look at this next slide, this is where they're coming off the ground, and essentially in this time you're seeing how they're coming off the ground, their posture is pretty straight, and they're exploding from the ground up, and they're starting to drive that acceleration from the ground up, and that's where, again, if a young player has too much of the weight on the front foot, then they're ending up in a position where they're maybe leaning forward rather than having this posture where they're going straight up through the serve. And one of the concepts that I think is very important for young kids to understand is that up is really the most important direction with the serve. Many times players look and they see where a pro lands into the court, and they're thinking, okay, I really got to jump far across the baseline. Well, that result happens because of a good load, a good kinetic chain with the players, and the stronger the player, sure, the more they're going to explode up, the more they're going to explode into the court. But really, the key is that the players are going up, and that way they're going to hit up through the ball, they're going to get their full extension, the highest contact, which is also going to help them have the best technique into the court. And so here at this next one, you see that they've already hit the ball, and this is another feature that many times with younger players, you'll see that they're already collapsed pretty quickly, sometimes before, but a lot of times right after they hit the ball. And in this photo, you see how both Madison Keys and Roger Federer, they have their body up, they have their head up, they have good posture even after they've hit the serve. So here's the landing part, and yes, they finish across the baseline. However, that's a result, once again, of them pushing up and slightly forward versus them trying to actually jump across the baseline. And, you know, they're balanced when they land, which is a great sign, and the result of all the work they did before. And, you know, the fact that their leg is kicking back, that's, again, a result of all the acceleration they produced. And players that are younger, they're not going to jump as far into the court because they don't have as much power. Their back leg is probably not going to go up as high because they don't have as much power. So when we are looking at what pros do and what juniors want to do, you want it to look similar, but there's just not going to be the same exact look because they generally don't have the same power that a pro has. And you know, so that's important to note that jumping across the baseline or having your leg kicked back, those things you want to have happen. However, it's not going to be to the degree of a pro when you're a young player. So we looked at platform. We're going to take a look here at two players that are pinpoint servers. I believe it's simpler to learn the serve as a platform server just because there's one less moving part, bringing that leg up. However, you know, there's obviously great servers that do both, and it's not bad if the young player is more comfortable bringing their back leg up. So once again, you know, the grip is the key here with pinpoint. These players have good grip. Then as they start to rotate back, you can see in Serena that she releases the ball for same type of look as Madison Keys, where the heel, the toes off the ground and most of the weight's in her back leg. Similar type thing with John Isner. He's a little more balanced, but with Serena and Madison Keys and Roger Federer, you see it's a little more pronounced, and you can see that for sure their weight is on their back leg as they release it. But once again, the challenge is when players are releasing and their weight's on their front leg, now they've lost a lot of that power that they have in the back. Using the back leg, they've also put themselves in a position where their posture many times they're going to lose their posture and hit down on the ball. So
just a question we're having, just to interject, but you know, how far should the ball drop after the toss and before contact?
Okay, so the ball toss is pretty much always going to drop. I mean, you don't want to have it super high because it means that players tend to wait, but there tends to be a little bit of a lag. So if it's dropping 3 feet, yeah, that's too much. If it's dropping 6 inches or a foot, that's not too bad. But the closer you can get it to where the ball goes up and their timing is there to hit it, not too far after it drops, that would be ideal. And that's, you know, as we look at these motions, you see somebody like a Roger Federer, his motion is a little more abbreviated than like a Serena or a Madison Keys. Same thing with John Isner, it's a little more abbreviated. So players don't have to have the, you know, Andy Roddick type take back, but the simpler the take back and the shorter the take back, then it's a lot easier to time it and not have the ball drop as much. So great question. So as we look in the next phase where they're starting to bring their leg up, this is obviously as a pinpoint, you are going to have your weight come into your front foot more as you bring your back leg up. And we look into the next phase. And then when they get into bringing their foot, it is again a balanced position where they're able to push from both legs and they push from the balls of their feet from their basically using their toes to explode up. And again, you see a good posture. We look into this next phase. Again, you see them exploding up, and you see that position where you can literally see that they've pushed from the ground, and this, with the kinetic chain, everything is going up through their body, and that's what drives things up through the arm, the acceleration with their arm. As we look in the next photo, again, good posture from Serena, not quite as good posture from John Isner. I would say that that's probably not normal. He probably normally has pretty good posture. This is just happens to be one photo that we catch him in this, but in general, if Isner had his toss back a little bit, then you would see probably a little more posture. So I don't know, for whatever reason, this one's a little further in front for him. But that's really, again, one of the keys that we look at with young kids is sometimes they're trying to toss the ball into the court, and they don't actually have the strength to get across the baseline to still be under it. As you see, Serena's across the baseline. However, the ball is under the ball. John Isner, in this case, the ball's actually a little further in front for him. Now, with his height, he can make up these things, but ideally, if we saw a junior player with this, we would say you need to bring the ball toss back a little bit so you can be straight, a line straight up and down, and not having that bend in the hips. And so, again, as they finish, you see they land, and again, good balance. A little bit hard to see Serena because of the dress, but you can see that they have that good posture, and they both get pretty far into the court. But again, I would say with young players, the result of that is, as you get older and you get stronger, that's what's going to happen. When you're younger, you're probably not going to get that far in the court if you're hitting up through the ball. Just going to jump back to one other point here. So at this point, a little bit hard to tell maybe in these photos. I'll go back to Matthews and Roger Federer where it's a little clearer. This is something we'll talk about a little bit later when we're talking about some things for juniors to learn. But essentially, the best servers go from with their edge of the racket up through to that point, right? And I go back here. So you can see it from this point to where Matthews and Roger Federer. You can see a little bit more. They're in a position where they're literally going to swing with the edge of the racket up through the ball, and then at the last second it turns to that point. So, we've seen, again, some of these things that pros are doing, and go forward a minute. And some of the points, the release and loading phase is very, very important. So, as I mentioned, the players releasing with their weight on their back leg is important, and then getting into a good load where they have the weight on both legs. And if a player is trying to think of weight on one leg more than the other, it's better to be thinking of the weight more in the back leg. And think of it as if you have a player hitting a forehand. You really want them to hold that load back until they start their swing. And players that get forward too early, that causes problem with their swing, and certainly causes them to lose power in their shot and cause them to lose balance. It's really the same idea with the serve. And as we look at the positions, the pushing up and extending to hit through contact, as you take video of your players, if at contact they have that good straight position that we saw with Madison Keys, Roger Federer, and Serena Williams, that's a really good sign. If you see that they have a little bit more of the bend that Isner, for whatever reason, had in that photo, that tells you something, and it might mean that they've lost something in the chain where the link is not as efficient, meaning they maybe have shifted their weight forward too fast, or their toss might be a little bit too far in front. And one of the points that I think is really important for us to understand is that there's good serve technique and bad serve technique. It's not male serve a certain way or female serve a certain way. And really, as you can see, if someone is very strong, Madison Keys, Serena Williams are strong, so they have serve that people might say looks a little more like, you might see a serve like a Roger Federer, okay, a guy's serve. However, even if you have female players who are not as strong, think back to Justine Hen when she was playing. She had really good serve technique, and she was not the biggest player, strongest player. She may not have hit it as hard as Serena can hit it now. However, she had, because of that good technique, very efficient with getting the most out of the serve and very efficient with her placement. So just as we go forward, looking at some of the things with the juniors. So transitioning to some ideas that I think are really important for kids to learn at the beginning. It's really important, I believe, to have a good grip. And one of the simple little exercises to them feeling that is bouncing a ball down with the edge of the racket. Essentially, the idea of thinking of this, you're hammering a ball down, and so you picked up a hammer to hammer it. Generally, you're picking up in a continental grip. And if kids are also playing slice mini tennis, if they're learning continental grip with their volleys, and if they're learning that grip, then when they go to the serve, it's a little more comfortable that they're used to holding the racket in that position. Now, it's definitely a challenge for them to learn to turn their forearm to get the racket straight. However, if they learn that grip at the beginning, if they learn to serve with that at the beginning, even if they're not super successful right from the start, you're avoiding having to change something later. So if players start with a grip that's a little more towards forehand, a little more to where they can come straight onto the ball, sure, they might be a little more successful with contact, but to have a very good serve later, you're going to have to change that grip. And I believe it's harder to change it from that than it is to learn it with the right grip at the beginning. And like I say, just that exercise is a good start, but doing like mini tennis, doing volleys where they're hitting a continental grip is a great way to learn the grip and learn to be comfortable with that grip. So, and another concept to me is when they're learning to serve, it's better to learn with them keeping their feet still because it allows them to just isolate the motion a bit, but it also is a great exercise for them to learn about their toss control. So if you toss the ball too far in front and you're serving with your feet still, you're going to have the ball, you're going to have to move your feet to get it, or you're going to lose your posture. So this is a great exercise for kids when they're starting to learn with it, without moving their feet, and also learn it with half motion. One of the things that like I said, starting with half motion, I like to start with it straight up and then learning to drop it down. However, if as players starting, they need to learn from it down to go up, that's fine. But the key part to me is learning to serve at the beginning with a good grip and with your feet still. It forces you to have a good toss. It forces you to have good balance. And a lot of times with kids, it can be a bit of a game to see, okay, can you hit it and hold your balance for 3 seconds after? And if they're finding that they're having to move their feet, sometimes it's a good exercise. Okay, toss it and let's see where the toss lands. And then they can realize, oh, it's landing behind me, or it's landing in front, or it's too far to the left or right. So this is a good way to warm up even as players are advanced. It's a good starting point as a warm-up. And with young kids, it's a good way for them to learn to serve even when they're playing. And once again, it's not that they have to be having explosive power at the beginning. What you're going to have is good mechanics and good balance, and I believe a good exercise to start with. And then another concept as we go along with this is, I'll jump back one step. So I think people were talking about, there's a question about the height of the ball top. So again, starting in this half motion, it's a good way to control the height of the ball tops because they shouldn't have to wait very long, and therefore if they're tossing at the correct height, the ball, if they're having to wait a long time, then yes, the ball toss is too high. But with a half motion, if they toss it just a little bit above contact, they should be able to move here and catch up and have good extension. And then as they move into a fuller motion, you have, Pete Sampras or Madison Keys who have these longer motions, and their timing is excellent, and they've learned those motions from the beginning. But if we have young kids learning from where they're starting down in a ready position and then just coming up a little more abbreviated versus going down and having that longer Sampras or Madison Keys stroke, that also will lead to them not having to wait as long for the ball, leads to them having, up to the contact point quicker, and therefore the ball toss won't drop as long. So really the start, those two things with a young player, good grip and serving without moving their feet, I think are very important. Then as players get pretty proficient with that, this idea of hitting up with the edge that I mentioned when we went back and looked at some of the Matt Keys and Roger Federer video, where you see the racket position is in that edge position down at the bottom, and literally most players bring it up, and at the very last second you have that edge go and then it turns, which is essentially what leads to the long axis rotation that we see, which people call formation. Essentially that they're going with that edge, and then by the fact that they're going so quickly from the edge to the contact, it just keeps moving in that long axis rotation. But a good exercise for kids to learn is to go up and hit with the edge of the racket, and it's also, a lot of times a fun exercise. And they start half motion, something they can do, going up and hitting with the edge, and then it's certainly a corrective technique. If players come a little bit kind of pancake towards the ball, then if they're doing this exercise, they're forcing them to relearn the correct motion going with the edge. But even players that have a pretty good motion, the idea of holding that edge to the last second and then turning it just before they would hit it with the edge is just a way of incorporating that. But that concept of sitting up to the edge is important as players advance with their serving. And this is an exercise that as we mentioned, we want players to keep the weight in their back leg for a long time. We want them to get used to using their back leg when they serve. So if players have again, if you have a platform, it's a little bit simpler with these motions, but still just the idea of learning to use your back leg and learning. We talk a lot about throwing from the back leg. Dr. Mark Kovacs talks about using, actually the shot put is a good way of learning to use the back leg, and going from the back leg up through, and also the idea with the shot put, you're a little more effective, the shoulder over shoulder action and the going up, versus sometimes when people are throwing, they're throwing a bit like a pitcher where they're throwing and going straight through, versus throwing up like quarterback throwing a Hail Mary, or an outfielder throwing from the outfield where they're throwing the ball up to the sky. And with a shot put, it's a little more that idea. And the last part of this that I believe is why Dr. Kovacs likes it so much is that with a shot put, you're staying sideways a lot longer, and you have that concept that if you look back again at Federer Keys, even at contact, they're very much sideways still at the ball, and they don't rotate too early. So I'm not a great shot putter, so anybody that's on the call that's a professional shot putter, forgive my technique, but essentially the idea is you're starting there, and you're loading back on the back leg, so the weight's coming off the front foot, and then as you go, you're pushing up, and again, the weight's really staying on that back leg, and there's this idea that you're going up, and you have full extension, and you're completely up as the ball goes up, and then eventually you will land on that front leg. But the idea that you're trying to stay sideways a long time, even as the ball releases, is important when you go with the racket in your hand. So again, some of these ideas for teaching the serve technique, the grip's very important, and keeping the feet still, and starting with a half motion is a good way, and then progressing to an abbreviated full motion. And then as players get better, leading with the racket edge. So another concept I didn't mention earlier, but as players are learning to serve, many times if they can be learning to spin the ball up, that's helping with the idea of hitting up on the ball. It also facilitates learning the right grip and leads to a better idea of leading with the edge. And then if they're learning to topspin the serve up, then as they get older and you're teaching a flatter serve, really they have that same concept of going up the edge, and they're just driving up and through a little bit flatter. And another benefit of learning topspin serve is earlier part of your tennis is you're learning a great technique for a second serve, and it's just I believe a good base once players have the basic idea of the grip and getting to the contact. Leading with the racket edge and learning a topspin serve at the start is beneficial. And then I'd say the idea of staying side on And when you're learning these things, whether it's leading with the edge or the topspin serve or staying side on, this is another part where I believe learning to serve without hitting these serves, all these serves without moving their feet, keeping their feet still is a great thing because you can tell whether they're staying side on or not if they're not moving their feet. They can feel it. The topspin serve is easier if you're learning side on. And for right-handers, learning to serve when you're doing it, serving to the ad side. For lefties, learning to serve, serving to the deuce side. Those are beneficial. That's beneficial to start on those sides because it just helps with the technique and with the concept of staying side on. And then when you transfer for a right-hander, transferring from the ad to the deuce, it's important for them to understand that you still do want to stay sideways even though you want the ball to go across your body. It's still important to have that technique of staying sideways. And then from these ideas, you incorporate that into the full serve techniques. It's emphasizing each point that I made, staying sideways as long as you can, hitting up into the court. And, when you're landing, sometimes it's not a bad exercise to exaggerate landing sideways into the court. But essentially when they land, they are going to be rotating. They just don't want that to happen too fast. So as I mentioned, Dr. Ben Kibler is someone who, when first started with the USTA, spent some time with us, and these things really, really apply to younger kids as they're learning. And as he mentioned, to be smooth when learning, and you worry about getting power as you get stronger, as you get older, and synchronize everything. This whole idea of the kinetic chain and it being effective at the beginning, when you have a good chain, it may not mean that you're actually hitting it as hard as you can. When you're a young player, sometimes you have actually more strength in your upper body, so you can throw your upper body at a shot, whether it's a ground stroke or a serve, and generate maybe more power at a young age versus having everything synchronized from the ground up and maybe not having quite as much power, but having a stroke that later on is going to be the most efficient, certainly for injury prevention, but also for power when you just learn at the beginning just that being synchronized. And then on the serve, the idea of pushing with the back leg, even when you're pinpointing, you bring that up, you want to be able to use both legs, and specifically for most players, pretty much players are always going to use their front leg to push, understanding that you need the back leg as much. And one of his things with throwing a ball up over a fence, which essentially forces players to throw the ball up to the sky. It could be the same idea of using a shot put, and whether it's throwing a tennis ball or a football or shot putting, all these ideas, the whole concept of this is the idea that players are learning to push up from their legs and have the ball go up and extend up. So these are all just good exercises. And when throwing or shot putting, get comfortable using the back leg. And then as coaches, as we watch servers, if we're standing behind the server, for a right-hander, standing a little bit behind to see towards the left side, because what you really want to see as players rotate back into a load position is you want to actually see their front hip. You want them loading back on their back leg with their back and loading on their back hip, and that would mean that you would see slight turn and actually be able to see a little bit of their front hip. And from the beginning, once players get proficient with making contact with the serve, the idea of serving to targets is important because, as you can see, somebody like Federer is not necessarily the hardest server, but he's incredibly precise, and therefore he may not get tons of aces, but he has the players out of position and he's in control from that first serve. And then players, we all are very visual learners, and it's important to video the serve, and show players video their serve. And not just things they're doing wrong, but as much as possible things they're doing right, so they can have in their mind. And you want the good things they're doing to be what they have in their mind as they're thinking of their motion, and you want those things to take over things that maybe are not quite as good. But video is a great way for kids to learn and a great way for you to show them some things that are good and things they need to improve in their serve motion. So as we've talked about through the serve, it's important to have good technique so you don't have injuries. At the end of the presentation, you get a link with the videos of some of these still photos that I'm showing, and also a lot more exercises that are good for injury prevention. Some of them are strengthening exercises, some of them are stretching. These are just a few of the good ones to stretch out. After you serve, to make sure that you keep good flexibility in your shoulders. This sleeper stretch is the one that our trainers are always saying is, if you're going to do one stretch for your shoulders, sleeper stretch is the most important, and it just promotes good flexibility in the shoulder, which again allows for good range of motion and also prevents injury. And one note with practicing the serve, one of the things that we tend to do, with all ranges of players is doing the serving at the end and doing, a whole bucket of serves. Ideally, it's much, much better to space the serving out through the practice. And if you're planning to hit 60 serves with a young player, if you space it out and they're doing 20 and then doing ground strokes, 20 and then doing volleys, and then another 20, they've done their 60 serves, but they've done it in a way where they don't fatigue their shoulder. They don't stress it as much as if it's spread out over the course of the practice. And the other reason I believe for doing it earlier is it shows the importance of it. If we're whatever we're doing at the beginning, one, they're fresher, their minds are a little more engaged, and those things we tend to do the important things at the beginning. So this would encourage you to certainly mix in serves at the beginning, and it's better, like I say, to spread it out over practice so you don't fatigue their shoulders. And it is probably a good idea to, just like with baseball pitchers, they have a pitch count. Good to keep track of how many serves players are hitting. Certainly if you're having a lesson or a group session and they're serving out of the bucket, you want to keep track of that. And as you get into them playing a set, that's really the nature of tennis. When you're playing a set or playing points, you generally are serving, playing, then serving again, and then somebody else is serving and you're doing returning. So there are natural breaks that are built into matches and point play, but you just also want to monitor just the total number of serves hit as you're going through a practice, whether it's match play or serving out of the basket. Sorry, there's one more exercise, but again, the sleeper one is the one that was really the one that was most important. But again, you get a video link of several ones. Some of them are strengthening, and some of them are, with things they can do with bands for strengthening and some more stretches. So just going into just talking a little bit about, players that are competing more, and just the idea of having a plan with serving, and with players that are younger or not quite as proficient, you can do these patterns and teach them these patterns with them serving and you feeding them the shot. And then as players get better, you can do these things with live play. Sometimes it's good to start off with the idea when it's live that the returner is always going to return in the middle. That way the server always has a chance for that first ball to execute patterns. And then as they get more advanced, you can play it. You can play it with score. I think it's better not to do these things with score when you want them to emphasize a certain pattern, because then they're focused on executing what you want versus they're always trying to win the points. You never have to worry about that, but they're focused on the point construction and developing their skills a little more if you're doing these things. So there are many, many patterns you can use, but these four are a good sequence that we've used with some of the players where we're serving wide and looking for a forehand to hit to the open court, and then they're playing out the point. And you can do it where, one player serves 4, the next player serves 4. You have more players on the court, they can serve 2 and rotate around. Then serving wide and then looking for either a forehand or backhand to hit and go to the open court and fall to the net. And the reason it's either a forehand or backhand is you want the players looking to come forward, and even if their forehand is their strength, once they start running around it, then they're losing some of that ability to take ground and take their time going to the net. But these are great exercises for kids to learn to look for a short ball and follow to the net after a serve. And then serving to the tee, and the same thing, looking for forehand or backhand to come in behind the player, and getting players to understand that you're moving a player and then trying to create open court to go in, and serving to the tee, you're having to move there and hitting behind it where the court's most open. And like I said, there are many other patterns you can use, but these are some good basic ones, and then you can move into playing 10-point tiebreakers. And this is where you can have them, as a coach, you can have them telling you the pattern before, just so that you know what they're thinking and you can judge whether they're executing it well. And also, if they're having to tell you, then you know they're thinking about it. And this is a chance where you can incorporate more between point routines and them understanding how they can do their routines, and having a plan is part of being ready to play the point. So you just build through this. And then as players get better and you're getting into tournaments and you want players to understand how there can be challenging situations where they're serving and you want to put them under a little more pressure to see how their serve holds up. Some exercises we've done where they're playing 10-point tiebreakers, and you're playing a normal 10-point tiebreaker, but one player is starting down 0-3. So now they need to basically find ways to hold their serve to stay even, and then still break to get back ahead. And generally, it's good to have the player that's down 0-3 starting as the server. And we've done it where sometimes, again, you have players that they may be someone's down 0-3, but they're actually a better returner, and they find their way to win those games. And then we challenge them the next one. Okay, now you're down 0-5. So now we're trying to find ways to challenge the player to have to be effective with their serve to overcome adversity. And then another way of doing this is having them play where they're playing 10-point tiebreakers, and one player has one serve and the other player has two serves. And generally, the player with two serves should be winning. However, if you have the player with one serve winning, then you create a little more stress for the next game, where they have one serve, but the other player has three serves. And again, these are just ideas you can play around with concepts. Two more that we do a lot, which playing sets where the games are 30 all and you're playing no ad format. So basically, the most you're going to play is 3 points, but each one's really important. You want to win that point to get up and have the ad, but then you want to for sure win that next point so you win the game, versus allowing them to get back to no ad where now it's equal. And it just creates, with the players that are serving, situations where they need to use their serve to gain advantage, and they're under a little bit of stress here, and hopefully when they get into competition it's not as stressful. And then another game we use where they're playing sets where they need to win 3 points in a row, and this goes into just their overall game where players that tend to maybe be a little bit sloppy with their point construction, a little bit sloppy with their concentration. If they play 2 great points and then they get sloppy, well, now they're actually down 1 point. And, so these are just situations that we use tactically to challenge the players as they get more advanced. So these are just, some of the things that we, like say, going through, kind of starting with looking at what the pros do, and then going into some things with players learning to serve, and then some tactical things, and then some challenging things for players. Back over to you, Brett.
Cool. Thank you so much. That was quite a lot, but I felt like I learned a lot. I felt like a lot of people, a lot of engaging questions as well. Just a few housekeeping questions before, and I'll just take a few at the end here as well. But a lot of questions related to, is this being recorded, and will we get a copy of this following? Yes, there will be a follow-up email sent to all people that have registered as well as attended. And in those follow-up emails you'll see from Adobe, there will be a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as there was a link mentioned from Richard about the videos for serve exercises after that you can use in your own practices as well. So keep an eye out for that in your email. And then side of that, we'll go ahead and pull a few questions. I think there's quite a few. So any questions that we don't have answered here, I'll provide a list over Richard, and we'll have them reviewed and sent out in the next week or so. But to go ahead and take a few out of here that I know are very interesting and related to junior plays. But one is just in terms of getting a player that may not be comfortable with the continental grip yet. Would you prefer to start them with that, or starting with more of a semi-western and then moving to a continental grip?
Well, really, if a player is starting off, ideally get them as close to continental as possible at the start, because they're starting with semi-western. They're just limiting themselves later, and they're going to have to change it. It's much easier to learn something than to unlearn it and then relearn, a new grip. I realize that one of the biggest challenges is for the kids, for the continental grip, to get the racket head square at contact, versus having it slide off the racket because they come with the edge. And a lot of times a good way is learning the continental grip is to actually have players serve, but like serving on the outside, and ask them, instead of serving into the box, serve it into the side fence. So they're over-exaggerating, so they're basically forcing them to overdo the turn, and then they realize, okay, I can do it, and now it's not such a dramatic turn when they're serving into the box. So it's definitely a challenge getting young players to learn this grip. If they're starting off with an Eastern forehand or semi-Western forehand at the beginning, they're probably going to be more successful. However, at some point, to have a good serve, they're going to have to make a change. And if you do start with that, I would constantly trying to mix into practice some work with the continental grip. So if they're starting with Eastern forehand or semi-Western forehand, and you say, okay, we're going to do 10 serves with a continental grip every practice, then maybe you progress to 15, and maybe that's the way you do it. But so much of it is how engaged the child is, and when you start with them. If you're the first one starting with them, it's a lot easier to get them to go continental grip and learn, like I say, by exaggerating to get the racket head square. When someone comes to you with a semi-Western or Eastern forehand serve grip, now you're automatically in that position of having to change the technique and have them relearn, and that's where we certainly would try to just gradually mix it in and let them know that this is the direction they're going in, but it's going to be gradual, so they're maybe not as panicked about the grip change.
Yeah, 1 year, so when we're talking about juniors tossing the ball, this coach is talking, a lot of the juniors end up, when they try to put the weight on their back foot, always end up tossing the ball behind them. Is there a way to help preventing them tossing behind them when their weight is on their back foot?
Sure. I'll actually scroll back to the Madison Keys and Roger Federer photos, because they give a great example of two ways to do it. But okay, so as you look here, you look at Roger Federer, Madison Keys releasing, and you see that Roger Federer is releasing more along the baseline. Madison Keys is releasing a little more towards the net post, which is generally, if we're teaching kids, we're talking about them releasing towards the net post. But if players are releasing along the baseline, that's completely fine as well. What you notice with both players, when they're releasing, they're opening their fingers as they toss the ball, and that's one of the keys. If they keep the ball in their hand and flip their fingers, then what you're going to see is that the ball, slips behind them. But if they can just release the ball about eye level and open their fingers, then they're basically sending it up in a straight line versus flicking it behind them. However, sometimes it's an exercise where they just practice tossing and opening their fingers. But for players that have a habit, it's undoing it. For young players that are learning, it's this concept that you're getting them to learn the technique of holding it a little more in their fingers and opening their fingers as they toss it. But tossing along the baseline is okay. Tossing it how Madison Keys is tossing a little more at 45-degree angle to the net post is also good. The challenge is when players are tossing it straight out in front, it's very hard to then have good serve technique. And it also leads to them tossing it too far in front. So you really want, if players are aiming for Madison Keys 45-degree angle, that's a good start. And obviously, Roger Federer is a pretty good example as well.
Great. Honestly, I feel like I find myself doing that pretty often personally. But another question, this is really kind of jumping back, but what age do you feel like you start working on serves in general, kids, and then maybe a progression of where you get more complicated the way they serve?
Yeah, so I spend a lot more time with older players, obviously, but with younger kids, they tend to be much better lower to the ground. So things with they're learning to hit forehands and backhands, they have just much more control of their bodies down there. When you start getting above their head, they just don't have as much control. They don't have as much spatial coordination up above. So if a player's starting out and you're getting them to try to serve, and you can tell that there's just no coordination there, it's okay not to have that be the start. It's okay for them to start off serving with an underhand serve or dropping the ball to start if they're playing. However, it's a good idea if you can to have them start learning to shadow the motion. It's obviously more coordinated tossing and hitting the ball, but if they're learning to start shadow that at the beginning, and again, that's another great way to learn the serve motion with a correct grip. If they're shadowing it, then there's less stress about making contact and good contact. But it's the exact age. It just depends really on how where the kids are with their coordination. And I would say let that really be your guide as you start. And the more you can introduce a little bit of, okay, we're going to shadow a couple of serves as part of each day, and then maybe you toss the ball for them and see how that works, and then you just progress. But progression at every age is very important, and you get creative with the younger kids with how you're starting. I can't say that there's a certain age. I've seen very young kids that are actually pretty coordinated, and some of that is because they've actually played tennis for longer. But I would just approach it that way. Take progressions and use coordination as a guide.
Okay, great. All right, we'll do one more. Just related to, it seems like a lot of people have issues with tosses and teaching tosses. Are there a few specific exercises or drills or whatever to be done to really work with the toss generally?
Sure. So, certainly, many people have done where you put the racket on the ground and you toss the ball and have the ball come down and hit the racket, or you've tossed the ball and have it come back into your hand. Those are not bad exercises for kids to understand. Like if a kid tosses the ball and it's 10 feet from where their hand is, yeah, they've got a lot of work to do, and therefore, they want to get pretty good at that exercise to where they're getting it closer to their hand. However, the fact that, and Dr. Mark Kovacs talks a lot about this, they've done studies where players that are great with tossing it without in doing these toss exercises, and then when they go to serve, their toss isn't actually that much better because it's just a different motion, swinging, starting your arm motion and tossing. However, I definitely recommend the idea of tossing and having it come back to your hand, or close to your hand, as a good start. And again, I go back to the idea of serving without moving your feet. If you're serving without moving your feet, your toss must be in a pretty good place for you to be balanced when you do that. So it's just a great exercise, and it's a great way for kids to go from, say, tossing and have it come back to their hand, to then actually going on their own and serving and, adding that in there. But I've not heard of anyone that has the magic of a good toss. It's just trying different things with kids and getting kids to be engaged and having simple exercises for them to do to learn it. So those are just couple thoughts, but I don't have something that's super unique from what most people have heard.
Well, thank you again. I'm going to scroll to the end here where we have just a thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Like I said, there will be a follow-up email sent out either today or actually it's tomorrow from Adobe. It'll come from the platform itself with the recording and a few extra resources. But I want to thank you for attending. And if there's any questions, make sure to email administration@usda.com. Right. Thanks so much. Good day.